Thank you for coming out tonight to the 5th annual Margaret and Terry Stent Distinguished Lecture in American Art. This important lecture series foregrounds topics in American art and provides the High Museum with an opportunity each year to bring a range of top scholars and professionals in the field to Atlanta. So when it happened that as we staged the largest exhibition of Western art ever to be shown at the High, and in fact, I'm told ever to be shown in the Southeast, when it happens, when we have a major exhibition like this of Western art, and one of the top scholars in Western sculpture also happens to occupy an office only a few paces away from mine, well, the stars had suddenly aligned. And I think I forgot to introduce myself. So you know, I'm Stephanie Meyerheit, the Margaret and Terry Stent Curator of American Art here at the High Museum. So right away, right down the stairs from me, we have one of the top scholars of Western sculpture. So now it seems like the first and most perfect opportunity to bring to the Stent Lecture stage our beloved director of the High Museum of Art, Michael Shapiro, for a few musings on one of the greatest artists of the American West, Frederic Remington. But before I do so, I'd like to offer my deepest thanks first to the many who had come together originally to endow this important lecture series. I consider the annual Stent Lecture not only an opportunity to share ideas and perspectives in American art, but also as a moment to reflect upon and celebrate the strength of community and all that community makes possible here at the museum and around Atlanta. So thank you. A big thank you also to Margaret and Terry Stent for the work that you have done and continue to do for advancing the arts in Atlanta. And I think it's a fitting tribute that this lecture series is named in your honor. And to Michael Shapiro, our man of the hour, and probably someone who everyone in this room is familiar with in some way or another. But that won't stop me from mentioning a few key highlights from a long and distinguished career. Michael joined the High Museum in 1995, and since 2000 has been leading the museum as the Nancy and Holcomb T. Green Jr. Director. During his now 13-year tenure as director of the High Museum, Michael has overseen the reinstallation of the museum's permanent collection, developed numerous partnerships with national institutions, and international for that matter, and spearheaded the High's major expansion of the Renzo Piano building that opened in 2005, creating a village for the arts here in Midtown. But tonight, Michael comes to us in his capacity as a scholar of American art, as a man who quite literally wrote the book on Frederic Remington that transformed our knowledge of this artist and his sculptural practice. The Remington Project, Michael's Remington Project, developed out of his dissertation work at Harvard University, where he wrote on 19th century American bronze sculpture and foundry practices, and led to his first major exhibition on Remington sculpture in 1980, and then to his second major exhibition on Frederic Remington in 1988, Frederic Remington, The Masterworks, which was staged in St. Louis and then later traveled to the Met, and for which Michael combined his expertise in sculpture with Peter Hasrick, another Remington expert who has a specialty in paintings. And Peter Hasrick happens to be at the Buffalo Bill Center for the West in Cody, Wyoming. Which brings us right here to the here and now, with the collection from Cody, Wyoming on view in our galleries, featuring over 20 works by Remington. Well, I believe we're in for a special treat. So let's please welcome Michael Shapiro.
So great to be here in Atlanta tonight. Thank you for inviting me. Wow. That's pretty good. Let's see, what would I like to do tonight? I'm hoping that I can convey a little bit of the character of Frederic Remington as a person, because he was, and as you'll see, larger than life in many ways. But he was extremely articulate. He was a wonderful writer. He was a polymath. He could really do, and you'll see, in terms of sculpture, he could do almost anything. And at the same time, I guess I feel like he's never really received his due And I'm pleased that there's an exhibition of Western American bronzes at the Met right now. So maybe we're at an inflection point in terms of appreciating the extraordinary innovations of Frederic Remington. Fred. He was a large man, 5'9", towards the end of his life, over 300 pounds. I know. He didn't know about the Atkins diet or any of that. He had sandy-colored hair and blue eyes and was born way upstate New York in Canton, the town that you see before you right here, just at the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. His father moved the family a few miles further north to Ogdensburg, where he grew up beginning in 1873. So Ogdensburg overlooks the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was, the St. Lawrence River was near and dear to his heart. And here he is. Here he is at 16 or so at the Highland Military Academy in Worcester, Mass. And from there, he went on and enrolled in the School of Fine Arts at Yale. Now, they don't just study art at Yale, apparently, but there he is. This was apparently, I learned, the last year of the 15-man football team. Walter Camp was apparently a famous coach at the time. He only lasted a year or so at Yale and dropped out shortly after the death of his father, the Colonel Seth Remington, and really kicked around. It was kind of a desultory time in his life. He met Eva Caton, who eventually he would marry, although her father rejected his first request to marry his Mr. Caton's daughter, because he was didn't seem to have any prospects of earning a livelihood. But eventually, the Catons submitted. And about the same time, Remington took off for Kansas for sheep farming and for wandering. And some people, though, said he was more Yale than cowboy. And actually, here he is as a cowboy, looking quite trim, I might add, in his full cowboy regalia. And in fact, he wore something like this when he first called upon the head editor of Harper's Weekly in New York City and received his first commission to illustrate in that magazine. And so beginning in 1886, he had a kind of meteoric rise. He bought this house in New Rochelle, New York, a suburb just northeast of New York City, and he called it Endion, which is Algonquin for the place that I live. It was a big house. That's his studio, right behind it. We're going to see this little window in one of the photographs, so take a look at the way it's leaded. You'll see that a little bit later on. So 5 years after being down and out in Kansas City, he was one of America's best-known artists. So here's the geography. Canton, where he was born. Ogdensburg, where he grew up from 1873 on. Inglenook, which is an island, it's a little bit this way, an island in the St. Lawrence River that he bought in 1890 for 5 acres. You'll see a picture of it in a second. New York City, the center of the publishing and artistic world. Mount Vernon, New York, is where the Henry Bernard Bronze Foundry was. Greenpoint, New York, is where the Roman Bronze Works was. And New Rochelle is where he was living for most of his career until the last 6 months of his life, where they settled in Ridgefield, Connecticut. So like so many people, like Teddy Roosevelt and others, he was a man of the East who went west and explained the West to those in the East. Here he is on that little island in the St. Lawrence River, Inglenook, place that he loved. His wife would not allow him to have any liquor when he was on this island, so he was very diligent. But he loved it. He built this studio, so he had great light over here, and he loved canoeing. He had these wonderful cedar canoes by Henry Rushton that were made, and then he would somehow squeeze himself in there and paddle away. But there's a quote, I think it was in an obituary of him, that he was never idle. He liked to get up start work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he would work until 3, and then he would go for a walk or a ride or bicycling. He got into bicycling, which was then the rage in the 1890s. In the last year of their life, in May, they moved into this house in Ridgefield, Connecticut, as a sort of a sign of their prosperity and his arrival as a major American artist. But he loved painting out of doors, sketching, and then taking it back to the studio. So there he is in front of the fireplace in his studio in New Rochelle. Just want to point out the skull that he had there. And, he lived a life of where he depicted conflict, of struggle. And the skull would have been an emblem of that. And here's one of his bronzes. It's his smallest bronze. It's called the Sergeant. I'm not really going to dwell on it tonight, but it's the most domestic-sized of any of his bronzes. So that's a little shorthand of his life. And now the sculpture. This is an illustration from 1892 of a bucking bronco. And by the way, Remington always spelled Bronco, B-R-O-N-C-H-O. He was a terrible speller, by the way. And there was a neighbor of his in New Rochelle, New York, a playwright named Augustus Thomas. And apparently Augustus Thomas came over and was watching him in the studio one day and said, Fred, you depict things the way a sculptor depicts them. And, head on, and then a back view, and a deep recession into space. And he gave Remington the idea in the early 90s of turning to sculpture. He got a little bit of advice, and he did a little bit of studied these photographs, and we'll see some other photographs later on, things that would stop the action. So keep this in mind in terms of the Bronco Buster sculpture that would unfold. Look at the mane, look at the tail, look at the placement of the hooves, the forelocks. He studied these more than people realize. So here's this wonderful letter, which he often would illustrate these letters, and it's one of the first image of the Bronco Buster that's known. Here's what it says. My oils will all get old and watery. That is, they will look like stale molasses in time. My watercolors will fade, but I am to endure in bronze. Isn't that great? But I am to endure in bronze. Even rust doesn't touch. I am modeling. This is 3 months after he started making sculpture. I am modeling. I find I do well. I am doing a cowboy on a bucking bronco, and I am going to rattle down through all the ages unless some anarchist invades the old mansion and knocks it off the shelf. How great is that? This was a letter, as you see, to Owen Wister, who was the great writer of The Virginian, really the first Western novel. So they were both in the forefronts of their respective fields and had a very extensive relationship. So here he is in that house in New Rochelle. Remember I said take a look at the window? He's up on the floor above the entrance, and he's modeling, and he's wearing, I think he looks really very sweet and dreamy, and he's wearing his little sculptor's smock, and he's got the turntable here so he can spin the sculpture around and look at it in different ways. He referred to sculpture as working in mud. And what he was referring to is plasticine. It's like clay, but it doesn't dry. And it meant that he could work on a model repeatedly without any problems. So he would work on the model, and eventually when he was finished, then the foundry people would make casts of it. So he worked in mud or in plasticine. And what's amazing to me is that his very first sculpture, I still, after 35 years, cannot get my head around it. His very first sculpture was, in my opinion, the greatest American sculpture of the 19th century. I don't know how that's possible, but somehow, and it took him months of work to get to this, and yes, he was a good draftsman on this subject previously, but he created a sculpture that is so iconic, so both aspirational, that suggests the interaction of man and nature, that ongoing struggle, and it does so with great detail. This is a sand casting done at the best foundry in America that did that kind of casting, called the Henry Bernard Bronze Foundry, which had great French workers at the time. One of the measures, how do you measure the success of a sculpture? Well, one of the measures of this sculpture is where it is displayed. Boing. Yeah. Every president has Remington's Bronco Buster in the Oval Office. I mean, just as one indication of the universal American appeal of this work of art. Later on, so he started casting at Henry Bernard in 1895. Around 1900, he switched. 5 years later, he switched to Roman Bronze Works, New York, a lost wax cast foundry. And you'll see the reason he switched was Henry Bernard burned down in 1898. And the timing was good because lost wax casting didn't exist in this country at the time, and it meant that he could get these textures. So you have the smooth chaps here, woolly chaps here. It means that he could change the position of the tail, whereas the Henry Bernard casts are all identical. They're all beautiful. They're all expert. But there was the opportunity for variety. So you see here the way the fender and the stirrups are up. Can you see that foreshortened? Here it's flat. So he was constantly trying to create more verisimilitude to this sculpture. He changes the position of the hand of the cowboy, and I think he even changes, as I recall, the position of the neckerchief, which moves a little bit towards the extended arm. Here's the back view. And sometimes you can see in the lost wax casts a real sense of the musculature, the sense of tendons and skin pulled taut over muscles that the patina and the structure of the sculpture really evoke. And you even get a feeling for leather or textured material, skin, bone. It's extraordinary. This is the little-known side of Remington sculpture, the underside. I wouldn't call it the dark underbelly, but this is the underside of cast number 40. And the 4-0 with a point and an underscore is absolutely typical. The way they're constructed is the horse has prongs that extend from the two hoofs, which fit into these two sockets, and then prongs or nails are driven in through the sides of the bronze, fastening the horse to the base. So when you look at a Remington Bronco Buster and you turn it over, this is what it should look like. This was a bronze that was given to Enrico Caruso, a friend of the founder of Roman Bronze Works. This is a very special bronze. This is a recast. So you look at that, well, how is it attached? Gee. And it's not as delicately, I mean, it's just, you can't see the reverse of the rocks on the top. That you can see them here, but you can't see them here. If you see a Remington bronze, this is the quick connoisseurship clue. If you see a Remington bronze, or something claiming to be a Remington bronze, and it's attached to a marble base, and it's screwed onto the marble base, I would be very suspicious. 9 times out of 10, or 9.8 times out of 10, it's a recast. So Remington was alert to this. Here he is writing to his bronze founder, Bertelli, my dear Bartelli, "Do you number every one of my bronzes which go out? This seems to me very important." I feel that that was a message from Frederic Remington to Michael Shapiro. You know, when I found those ledger records, which indicated when Remington's casting was done during his lifetime and afterwards, I didn't know much about Remington at that time, but I called someone who had written about Remington, and I said, I think I have these records, and the person said, "Oh, well, stay right there. I'd like to fly up and take a look at that." So I knew at that point, I said, that won't be necessary, but I knew at that point that I had something very special. His second sculpture is called the Wounded Bunkie. This is a cast that Remington gave to Yale when they awarded him an honorary degree, even though he only had attended there for 1 year. And it's a great piece, cast by Henry Bernard, and it's 2 cavalry officers, and the rear officer has just been shot. And if you look closely at the cast, there's one in our show, isn't there? Am I right? Is there a cast? No. Why am I thinking that? I thought there was. Isn't there one? Is there a Wounded Bunkie in the show? Yeah, I thought so. I thought I was looking at, yeah, because he's got a little bullet hole, right? Right over there. And his bunkmate looks out, and he's looking at you. He's looking at you, but he's looking at where the shot came from. It really is an extraordinary moment. And of course, Remington always is trying to defy gravity. He's trying to lift as many legs as possible off the ground. And of course, any sculptor has to obey the rules of gravity. But to have the chutzpah, not a word that's usually applied to Frederic Remington, but it's accurate, to defy that is really an act of courage and bravery. Here's the rear side. The third sculpture, the Wicked Pony, is in some ways the reverse of the Bronco Buster. So he was taking the rising horse, let's slope it down. Here's some of his working methods, though. Here he is posing a friend of his, trying to figure out how would he make this work. So there are all these steps: drawings, letters, poses. If you look at the Remington studio, which the Buffalo Bill Museum purchased, there's a barrel in the studio, and he would have his friends sit on the barrel, which was horizontal, like a horse's saddle, and they would play the role of some of the figures in his work. So here he is, Remington to Owen Wister. "Want you over here, got big ideas, heap talk, new mud." Isn't that great? Like a little boy. "How the Bronco Buster got busted. It's going to beat the Buster or be a companion piece." Actually, it's one of the rarest of Remington bronzes and wasn't particularly popular, but still an excellent piece. Here he is, where he says, "You must look very carefully, Bertelli, to see that all the works leaving the foundry are copyrighted." And all of them are copyrighted, and he has little descriptions that go with the copyright statement. And the copyright, very hard to see in this slide, is right over there. Or the Outlaw, where, okay, can I take the horse, get all 4 hoofs off the ground, and I'll balance it on top of a sagebrush? I was like, really? I mean, it just doesn't exist in the history of sculpture. And you can imagine the bronze founders were going, oh my God, how do I make this work? Because it's got to support the weight. Now, you can't do this in plaster, you can't do it in marble, you can do it in bronze because it has the tensile strength to potentially support the weight that's over it. And look how much he loved the textures of the base. And if you just rub your hands on it, you can feel the sharpness of the bronze. This was a Christmas card, you can see. Merry Xmas Bartelli from Remington. So here's the cartoon. There's our friend, Fred. He's got his smock on, has a little modeling tool in his hand. This is the profile of the man who started Roman Bronze Works, Riccardo Bertelli. And here's his little mustache suggested right there. And so Remington says, can you cast him? This looks like the Outlaw. Can you cast him? And Bertelli says, do you think I am one of the Wright brothers? Yeah, it was real. I mean, they were really challenging each other, and they were pushing each other. It was a partnership. It was like a master artist and a master printmaker, a master sculptor, and a master bronze founder. Very rare in the history of American sculpture. So here he is as a businessman saying to Bertelli, hey, Tiffany's is going to be out of bronzes, especially the Bronco Busters, long before Christmas, and it seems to me we'll have to raise the price of the Bronco Buster. What do you think? Yeah, as I recall, $125 was the original price for the Bronco Busters at Tiffany's. It's all in the ledgers. So the scalp, or the victory, is an Indian holding a scalp in his hand, and the horse at the rise of a hill in this noble, really comes out of Roman sculpture. So this is a classical pose. Instead of Augustus Caesar, you have a Native American. And so this is a Henry Bernard cast, and the sand casts are characterized by smoothness of surface, elegantly cast, beautifully chased, that is finished, and beautifully patinaed in a nice brown patina. But then he, years later, went to Roman Bronze Works and rethought this same sculpture. Here he is modeling the scalp. You're standing right behind him. I sensed a little male pattern baldness, but I don't see that in the literature. But it's a great thing, kind of tipped backwards. And here's the Roman Bronze Works version. So he goes back and revels in the textures, the undercuts, the rocks that you couldn't really cast in the sand casting method. They're both great. They're just different vocabularies that an artist could use. So the smoothness of the skin, the elegance, really looks like a classical Roman sculpture. This looks sort of more honed down, a little bit more visceral. The very first Remington sculpture that was done at Roman Bronze Works was actually this sculpture, extremely rare. Only 3 casts were ever made, and it's called the Norther. And so this cowboy is got a bit of a problem. It is freezing cold out. The wind is coming at his back. It's whipping. The horse has this thick winter coat. He's got his hat, his cowboy hat, tied down with his neckerchief around his head. He is hunkered down. And if you could, I don't know if I have a view of the front, the horse's eyes are narrowed in this blistering wind. So he writes to his Yale friend, Julian Ralph, says, I have been making bronzes, 3 in Cire Perdue, lost wax, with good results. The Henry Bernard Bronze Company went up, that is, burned down, owing me more money than I care to say. this is a drawing in a letter that he did for the Cheyenne. And I think it's a really interesting drawing because it has, as you'll see when I read the text, it has this little dotted line here. And it makes you really think about trajectory, forward motion, propulsion, the kind of, I would just have to say, American drive, forward, forward, forward into the future. It's all there in this sculpture. All four legs off the ground, moving forward, the tail like a jet engine. It's incredible. So here's parts of his letter writing to the bronze founder. He sends this to Riccardo Bertelli and he says, "The dark black means the buffalo robe falling on the other side of the figure. You see it comes kind of to the rear. The buffalo robe comes to the rear of the perpendicular dotted line. Do you think it can be made to support the figure? Will this thing hold? Can it, is it going to fall over? I very much want to preserve the effect of the action, which would be ruined by bringing it too far forward." So if you brought the buffalo robe too far forward, it would decrease the forward trajectory of the sculpture. It was all about, I mean, this is a rocket ship. We have a car show we're going to do in next summer, and this is just like the fastest sports car ever, the way I see it. Here it is. I mean, it's just awe-inspiring to me. But if you could see this is a great black and white photograph, but the patina of this bronze is actually a mustard yellow. And the skin is tight, the hair is standing upright, the Indian is gripping the horse with his knees. And look, it's right, this is the buffalo robe falling on the other side of the sculpture, just as Remington indicated, supporting this right rear leg, which holds the entire sculpture up. And look at that jet engine. Woo, that is smoking. Edward Mybridge in 1880 really articulated for the very first time how horses actually ran. No one knew. If you look back on British sporting painting of the 18th and 19th centuries, you'll see all kinds of interesting configurations, hypotheses about the way the legs were. And people didn't know, are they all off the ground at one time or some on the ground? Who knows? But it was Mybridge, sponsored by Leland Stanford, who was able to capture this, and Remington studied it very carefully. So you can see photography into sculpture. So here's an illustration that he did of these drunken cowboys coming into town. They've worked hard all week, I must say, they did. And Remington took this idea, and you can see that they're just kind of meandering into town here, shooting their guns. But look, they've got, they're just sort of walking into town. He had these ideas in which he would make a sculpture where he says, I have reconstructed the right-hand man, you'll see in a second, the farthest right man, and made it much better with a foot on the ground. Now I have 6 horses' feet on the ground and 10 in the air. So 4 horses, 16 legs. And here he is to Owen Wister. I go to the Roman Bronze Works, leaving New Rochelle at 8:20 in the morning to work out a 4-horse bronze, and I reach this above oasis at 6 p.m., eat, smoke, go to bed, and day after day I'm to do this until I die to complete this bronze. It's visceral. There it is. And what about the legs? Hard to make it out, but they're 10 in the air, 6 on the ground, and none for this horse on the your far left. Here it is in plaster at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And you can see, because it's plaster and not supporting material like a bronze, here are rods here and here that are holding it up. This sculpture no longer exists. It was only done in plaster. What was in St. Louis then was shipped to a fair in Portland, Oregon, and presumably destroyed. Remington kind of liked what he called men with the bark on, and plain-speaking kinds of folks. And this mountain man was one of the models. If you look at his bedroll and his rifle here, hat, you can see that there's wonderful little things like the little drinking mug that he has hanging off of here, and there's like a little whip that's attached to his hand. He's holding on to the back here. And I think it's one of the most creative solutions of a base in the history of sculpture. The idea of a base, normally, it's like this piece of wood. It supports what's on top of it. Here, the base is the subject. The base is part of the narrative, that it's in it. It's what's supporting it. It's a fantastic idea. He took photographs when he traveled, and this is when he traveled to Germany. This is a German soldier who's got a pretty amazing horse. But he had these in scrapbooks, which he could refer to when he was making his sculptures. He did other versions, though. He ultimately changed the back right leg of this sculpture and brought that leg forward. It apparently didn't feel it looked quite right in the earlier versions. I think it's kind of great because it sort of suggests real space rather than sculptural space. And I love the idea of the horse who's really paying attention, being careful where to put that hoof. The rattlesnake, some people say it was Remington's favorite sculpture, and you can see the narrative. Here's the rattlesnake, and the horse is focused right at it, pulling away. The rider is gripping to hold on here. He's looking down as well. It has this spiraling action, and Remington really wasn't satisfied with it. So later on, he did another second version, a larger one, where, I think it's much more convincing. I love them both, but this is much more convincing kind of spiraling action. And if you, sort of a fun game, at least to me, is to try and figure out this sort of center of gravity in these two sculptures. The horse leaning back, the rider leaning forward. Here, his pose, to me, is not as convincing as in the second version. And in the second version, I think there's a spiraling torque of the horse and of the rider that is really, I think, miraculous. Wonderful textures of the base, sharp, you could cut your hand on it, and the woolly chaps of the rider, and a great snapping tail behind it. I have a bunch of slides of this because it's just the most outrageous sculpture. It's this great collision of an Indian, a horse, and a buffalo. So here is Remington in his studio. Look, he's into it. You could just see. He's posing, but he's just having a great time. You can see the clay-like makeup here. Here's one of his modeling tools. He's got the buffalo. There's a buffalo head. Here's the horse hanging over it. It'll be clearer in 1 second. Isn't that awesome? So, of course, it's all balanced on these two hind legs, plus this spear coming down here. Love that somersault. And here you see it in the studio and in reality. This is a case where subsequently he did a painting, and of course in the painting, the Indian doesn't have to hold on at all. We don't have those gravity issues, you know? So it's really, really kind of, it's just, what a great conception of just pushing the boundaries as far as he possibly could. Clearly, I mean, it's just wonderful. And to look at the surprise on that horse's expression. And look at the texture of the hide of the buffalo. Look at how wonderful that is. It's like an ocean of clay. So late in his life, he returned once more to the Bronco Buster. There had already been the Henry Bernard cast of the Bronco Buster, the Lost Wax cast of the Bronco Buster at Roman Bronze Works, and then he writes to his friend, now it's 1909, he's in Connecticut in his fancy new house, and he says, "My dear Bartelli," you know, he's worked with him for 9 years, he still can't spell his name right. 1.5, 36 inches is the best size for BB. Make it so, as they say on shipboard. I am at the group. Now that's another sculpture. So he's basically saying, I want to redo the Bronco Buster 1.5 times larger, so a 36-inch version rather than 24-inch. And I'm working at this other group that you'll see in a second called the Stampede. And then he complains he had a head cold, which made him a snuffling idiot of me. So here's the late large Bronco Buster, where he gets rid of the quirt, and he has the rider's hand extended out for balance. The head of the rider has moved a little bit. It's a little bit more in profile. The mane is become sort of like a wall of hair up there, and it has a kind of majesty to it. These were never cast during his lifetime. He was working on it at the end of his life, but this and the next sculpture, called the Stampede, were cast after his death. So here he is again. Say, Bartelli, you ought to see the 1.5 Bronco Buster. I love this line. It will make your eyes hang out on your shirt front. This size lends itself to my hand much better than the smaller. So this is the last sculpture that he was working on, called the Stampede. I shall be ready very soon now with the group. 1 cowboy and 4 steers and a big plinth. The big plinth is this big bronze base over here. It will be quite a job, and tell him to put his time on it. If this isn't a killer, I'll quit clay. So it was, I think, as Stephanie referred in her introduction, I think it was in the introduction, where you mentioned that oh no, it was earlier today, you mentioned that he died of appendicitis. So it was 1909, December. He'd had some stomach aches, and then was operated on kitchen table in that house in Ridgefield, and died very late in the year, 1909. And according to David McCullough, the great historian, he loved horses, dogs, good cigars, snowstorms, and moonlit nights, and he loved nearly everything ever put on his plate but spinach and Virginia ham. When he was drinking, which was often, he preferred scotch or martinis, and apparently he could drink just about anyone under the table. Just after his death, Teddy Roosevelt said, "The Indian is civilized, the cowboy is passing, one man's work will preserve them for all time in pictures and in bronze. This man is Remington." Thank you very much.
We'll take a few questions.
I just wanted to know how they knew how many of the casts to make, how they decided that for each particular work.
So Remington actually made a list at a certain point in time of the numbers of casts at that point that were made of the sculptures. He was market driven, so in terms of the Bronco Buster, they were going to keep going. And you could see from the letters that they were very close in touch with Tiffany's and a couple of other outlets in New York and Boston and elsewhere. So it was a tightly overseen business relationship, sort of a triangular trade between high-end jewelry stores / galleries, the Foundry, and Remington. So I don't think there were really limits, but there were some where for some reason he decided it would either be unique or there would be only a limited 2 or 3 casts. But most of them were open-ended editions. But what the ledgers showed, though, is there were far fewer lifetime casts than people realized. So the Lost Wax cast version of the Bronco Buster, there are something like almost 300 authorized casts, and about the first 90 of them were during Remington's lifetime. So what happened, just to brief you on that, you saw a picture of Eva, his wife. So after Remington died, his wife had the authority to continue the casting. Which she did. She was authorized to, and it was appropriate. So the Foundry would continue making them. But when she died, her will said that molds and models should be destroyed. So shortly after her death, there was a big flurry of casting at Roman Bronze Works, and then the molds were destroyed, and it was over, around 1918 or so. Yes? No. I could do it, but it would be excruciating for everyone else. But basically what happens is that the artist creates a model, and they take piece molds. The foundrymen take piece molds of different aspects of it. And they create a master mold, and then the master mold is taken to the foundry, and it's, how would I say, invested with this material internally and around it. And then they put these, what are called sprues and other things, and they pour the bronze in. And when you take the molds off, it's a very ugly thing. And you need these hammers and chisels to peel off the excess bronze. And then there are what's called chasers, people who smooth, refine, create the nuances of the detail or emphasize the details that are already there. And then people use various acids and leads and blowtorches to add the patina to it. So it's like sausage making. It's not, the finished product's pretty great, but it's pretty wild in the process. Yes, ma'am.
Bronco Buster, you've got this.
Oh, I think he made 24 sculptures. You know, and his life as a sculptor was basically 15 years. It was extremely, I mean, intense. He must have been, and people wrote about his ability to focus was extraordinary. And the idea to work, the first Bronco Buster took him 9 months in solitude making this thing. And he made a masterpiece. Sir.
Take one more.
Brian Dippy wrote a catalog. He continually brings up Remington, Roosevelt, and Worcester. And I couldn't get out of my mind the last scene from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where the guy says, when the legend becomes fact, you print the legend. Did these three guys create what we now still think of as the Wild West? And did they ever think of the Native American as the noble savage?
Yes, they did create our view of the West. There's no question about it. That's a great comment, and Brian Dippey's a terrific scholar. And the views of Native Americans would not be politically correct today. Let's put it that way. Yes, sir. I think we're running low. Yes. The values? Well, usually the least expensive Remington bronze is the Sergeant, although it's actually quite a rare bronze. There are very few of them that are lifetimes cast. It's that little one that was on the hearth there. And those would be under $100,000. And you can get late casts of late lost wax casts of the Bronco Buster, probably in that range, but probably anything that's really lifetime that isn't the Sergeant, it would be north of $100,000. And if you get something really rare, like a woolly chap Bronco Buster or something like the Norther, or, you know, it could be millions.
Thank you all for coming
Thanks a
tonight.
lot. That was fun.
Thank you
Bye.
to Michael and to the Stents for making this lecture possible.